Welcome, everyone. Hopefully you got some refreshments. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I know not everybody thinks this is the sexiest topic out there, but it's important. So a couple of thank yous are in order. I want to thank Linda Montecalvo, who's our volunteer, and Alex, who's helped organize this. A very special thank you to Larry Weissman, who enabled us to put this program together. And a very special thank you to Sharon Bradley, who is sitting in at the last minute for one of our speakers, Deb Muller, who wasn't able to make it tonight. So I am very thankful for that. We hope you'll leave here knowing more about what to expect at the end of life for both yourselves and your loved ones. It's something we don't focus on enough in advance, so we're often unprepared when the actual time comes, which it will eventually someday. So we're glad you're here. By way of introduction, I'm Julia Portali, the Executive Director of Fairfield County House. We're a 6-bed assisted living facility in Stamford for those people who are on hospice care, and I see some of our staff are here as well. You'll hear more about this later, but just to clarify, hospice care is focused on comfort and quality at the end of life. It's not designed to shorten or lengthen one's life, but let each person come to their natural time with as much comfort and love as possible. So tonight we have 3 panelists, as you can see. One of them took my advice to break a leg, literally, except he got the wrong limb. Each of the panelists is going to describe briefly different parts of planning for end-of-life care. First, we thought it would be really helpful to talk a little bit about what it looks like at the end of life and how to have conversations with loved ones. Then we wanted to share some specifics about palliative care and about hospice care to clarify some of the differences, because when we work with people, we find that there is some confusion there. Each panelist will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then it's your turn. So we hope you guys have a lot of questions this evening, and we look forward to trying to answer them. And so let me just introduce our panelists. Right here with the broken leg is Dr. Michael DeVita. He is, I'm not a nurse, so that's my problem. He's a critical care and palliative care physician of many years. He was the chair of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center Ethics Committee for 21 years. He's now at Harlem Hospital in New York City, where he's the director of the palliative care service there. He's published over 100 articles on critical care, palliative care, and ethics, and authored a number of books on critical care. So I think he knows what he's talking about. Next to him is Dr. Donna Coletti. Some of you may know her. She's a longtime local. She's a palliative care physician in private practice and consulting physician at Greenwich Hospital Palliative Care. She's also a scholar in residence at the Egan School of Health Sciences at Fairfield University. And she's one of the most spiritual people I've ever met. So for example, yesterday, she was taking care of her newborn grandchildren and also helping a gentleman and leave his life. So she really does go at both ends of the spectrum, even sometimes on the same day. And then finally, and after that I'll be quiet, Sharon Bradley is the clinical faculty at Sacred Heart University. She served as the president and CEO of the nonprofit Visiting Nurse and Hospice of Fairfield County for over 20 years and continues to serve on their board of directors. And all 3 of these lovely people are also on the board of the Fairfield County House, just in terms of transparency. So without further ado, Dr. DeVita, I'm not going to take your notes with me.
Said 4 inches. I want to start by saying I am so honored and delighted to be here tonight, and extremely grateful to my wife who introduced me to Donna Coletti and got me involved with Fairfield County House, and I've been very grateful to be part of that fantastic organization. This is my kind of humor. Death is a 4-letter word. It's got all kinds of connotations there. But, 4-letter words are words that you don't typically talk about in public. It's usually behind closed doors, and you really shouldn't say it all the time. And death is being treated as if it is a 4-letter word. People go through great lengths to try to avoid talking about it often. There are very strong cultural barriers, particularly in several different cultures around the world. And it is such an important part of life. To ignore it or avoid talking about it really is going to lead to some problems. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what it looks like and how to get into the conversation and types of things to expect when people give the conversation. So I'd like the next slide. So there's several trajectories of death that have been discussed, and this is all just rough drawings. There's really there's no data behind this other than to say if the first one's sudden death, you're fine, you're just walking down the street, and something, bam, happens to you. There's really not an opportunity there to intervene, to improve your quality of death, if you will. The other three, however, are pretty characteristic trajectories. The first is somebody with cancer. Typically, not always, typically cancer, when it's first diagnosed, we're feeling pretty well. We might be a little bit off, but it's not like we're devastatingly ill. And people tend to do pretty well, and then the deterioration is rather quick. I should tell you that the horizontal axis here is measured typically in years. We're not talking about days or weeks. Heart failure and chronic obstructive lung disease are a little different. People might be fine, and then they'll have a deterioration, and they get better, and they deteriorate, and there's this kind of up and down course that can make people think, well, I'm getting better now. But if you notice, each of those ups are not quite as high up as the one before. And so there's a deterioration, and it's really hard to figure out whether this dip is going to go into a rise or whether this is the big dip. And so so the best time to get into these conversations, since you don't know which dip is the right dip, you want to talk about it very early. And I should tell you that those red arrows are where you should start talking about things. And finally, frailty. Frailty is only just being recognized scientifically in medicine. I think we all know what frail it looks like and what frailty is. It's actually a measurable thing. And we can call it the dwindles. And people kind of peter down. And this is one of those things, as soon as people start getting frail to the point where they're needing any assistance to get along with their activities of daily living, they are already frail. They're way down the road here. And so you want to, in all of these situations, you want to address death and how we might like to die as early as possible. So let's talk a little bit about death. TV is actually not bad at showing us what death looks like. I think it sort of comes in 2 or 3 flavors. For this population, I think we're talking about a well-managed death or poorly managed death. When it's managed well, it really doesn't look too different from falling asleep. It is typically a neurologic and respiratory event, so you expect consciousness to go off and then the respirations to go down and people pass away. And I think that is probably, if I was to take an audience poll, I won't, of how you'd want to die. People typically say, I want to die peacefully, in my bed, no pain, with my family around me, perhaps some spiritual things going on in the room as well. A bad death, which is the other type of death you see on television, is the one where people are agonizing and screaming and that is why we have hospice and palliative care, is to prevent that from happening. It is absolutely preventable all the time if you plan ahead. So the notion of death is something that most of us don't see anymore, but the generation ahead of us, 1 or 2 generations, death happened at home much more frequently than it does now. It's been medicalized, and I think there's a lot of gratitude we have to have for hospices and hospice and palliative care around the world for focusing on demedicalizing the death process. Talking about death can be very hard, and I think in my experience, and the research shows us that most people want to talk about death, but don't. Most doctors want to talk about death and don't. And the fascinating thing is doctors expect the patients to raise the topic, and the patients want the doctors to raise the topic, and so what happens is nobody talks about it. And I get consults of people who have had deteriorating severe neurologic disease, and they've been dealing with all the problems that can cause for years. And then I get involved for the last 1 week. And it can really be a tragedy to get involved that late. So of the people who want to talk about death, less than 1 in 3 will actually have done so. In fact, when I ask people, have you thought about your death? They'll usually say, well, yeah, I have my burial plot set up, and I've got my will set, and we know which funeral home it's going to be. And I said to them, that's after death. What I want to talk to you about is how we're going to finish our life off and how we're going to make sure that you have what you need when the time comes. So I think it's obvious that we should be talking about it, and so why don't we? We tend to use euphemisms, or we give very hopeful responses. Don't worry, it'll be okay, and when we know in our heart it's not going to be. And it's typically fear or awkwardness, or we're afraid we're going to bring up emotions that we don't know how to manage, or we're afraid that we won't be able to manage. And that can be a big deterrent. So you have to go into this with the intention of speaking about this. And it's important to realize how important it is to talk about death. So the consequences of not talking about death are you don't get the death you want. You don't get to close loops. Most people are carrying some emotional baggage or psychological baggage that we might like to talk to loved ones about, strange people, and other problems. So when you don't do that, that important part of your needs at the end of life can be absolutely ignored. The consequences of talking about dying, I think the worst case scenario is somebody might get some mad or cry. And maybe people are very respectful of the doctor going into the room and talking about it, but nobody has ever said, what are you bringing up that for? Not one time. Often, probably like 50 to 75% of the time, people say, oh, thank you, I've been wanting to discuss this with somebody. You're the first person I've been able to talk to about this. It reduces isolation. So if I'm afraid that I'm going to die and I don't share that with somebody, think of all the burdens you're carrying around in life, and one of them you just can't talk to anybody about. That's a huge weight. And I think that the most important consequence of talking about it is you get to share the experience with others and get the support from others that you need. Bringing up the conversation, I can tell you, I was never taught how to bring up the conversation, so I learned this by trial and error, and I learned that the best way is you just ask, you know. You're getting older, Dad, you know, have you thought about whether you're going to die soon or what you would like? And often I'll get people laughing at me. What do you mean have I thought about it? I'm 85 years old. Of course I've thought about it. Well, have you talked to anybody about it? No. Would you like to? And I think a direct, simple, non-judgmental discussion, have you talked about, would you like to? So you want to give them the control as much as possible, allows them the opportunity. And if they say no, you say, okay, I get that, but let's have the door open. And I think using the word dying or death or die, if you use that word, you've broken the glass. And it gives you the opportunity to come back at another time and have that conversation later. Okay, well, why don't we talk about it sometime later? It's something that we really should get to. As they talk to you, I find it's very helpful just to keep asking questions. Well, how do you feel about that? What do you think that leads to? How do you see these things? What can we do to help you? Are you getting the help you need? And just a lot of questions, and people will just open up and tell you quite a bit, especially if you're not judgmental. You don't want to be sad with them. I find being neutral and empathetic really works very well. And there are some things that you should really try hard to listen for. And this has been studied, which is what are the concerns that people have at the end of their life? And I bet if I took a poll here for everybody, I'll give you a piece of paper, write down, I'll bet at least half of people would say pain at death, or fear of pain. There's been a number of studies on this, and it actually ranks very low. In some studies, it's not even in the top 10. Most of the time, people are worried about being a burden, being dependent, especially if they're a very independent person. They haven't had the opportunity to talk to some loved one that they haven't spoken to in years. I remember one woman I was talking to, she had a niece, a daughter, and her daughter had a niece who had the same name, and they had kind of worked out a deal on who's called what. I don't want to use the names. And one of the dying wishes of the mother, or grandmother and mother, was that they would stop fighting. And they were fighting over what mom needs most at the end of life. And so we had a powwow together, and we talked about how much they loved each other. And I gave them an opportunity to discuss that, and then find where we're together. And we found, well, okay, what are we going to do today? And what are we going to just leave on the table? We'll deal with it another time. The next day when I saw the grandmother was in the hospital, she was crying. She was so overjoyed. They've made their peace. I have lived to see them get themselves together and be on the same page. So that really ranks way higher than pain. And actually, pain is pretty easy to manage. And most of the concerns that people have at the end of life are pretty well managed if you just open the door for the conversation. This is the next slide, I like to think of this whole enterprise as safe dying. We've talked a lot about hospital safety and safety in the ICU and stuff. We don't talk too much about safe dying. Death can be very tragic if it's mismanaged, and we really want people to have safe dying so that we have an opportunity to discuss all these things. And it's really important, and it's never too soon. The way you'll find out it's never too soon is they'll tell you it's too soon. And talk to me next year or something like that. I'd like to talk, just as my final comment, and I'll let you up here. Hope. We are all focused on hope for extending our life. And when you talk to people, I just want my mother to live another 2 weeks, or if she could only do this, I'm hoping that there'll be a miracle and she can live longer. And that's going to fail. At some point, that's going to fail. Nobody yet has survived life. And so I think it's important to find the hopes that are realistic. You can say, okay, let's hope for a longer life, but what are the realistic hopes that might be important? It might be, let's not die on Christmas. It might be, I want to die with my loved ones at my side. I want to die after I've had a chance to talk to so-and-so to make my peace. So you want to find the good hopes, and that's usually a shared journey to try to figure that out. In sum, what do patients expect and deserve? What does everybody expect? We don't have to get real fancy about this. They want honesty, and they want caring. That's all. If you do those two things, be honest with people about what the situation is, care for them the way you would want to be cared for, you're going to do just fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for all the kind words that you showered upon me, because it truly is my privilege to work with such an outstanding group of people and for such a meaningful cause. What I left off my bio is actually I was an OBGYN for 17 years. And most people ask me, how did you do that? How did you go from here to there? And what I usually say is that I think it's the Lion King. Life is not linear. It really is the circle, with birth and death being that same point on the circle. It's about transition. And it's about helping people through their transitions. And that's where I see the overlap. So I think there's a lot that palliative care and obstetrics and gynecology have in common, granted, not men. So what I would say to the patients who then I had to say, I'm your first and last gynecologist, which usually kind of breaks the tension because I use that slide. Oh, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, thanks. There's the metaphor of the tightrope that we walk in palliative care. Because it's not a physical one, obviously, it's really the emotional tightrope. And it's the emotional tightrope that all of the stakeholders bring to this conversation. And what do I mean by stakeholders? I mean the patient, their loved ones, the caregivers who are the boots on the ground taking care of them, which are often hired people. There's their primary care physician. If they're in the hospital, there's the hospitalist, there's the house staff, there's the nurses. There's a lot of people that come to these conversations, and each one of them has their own perception and perspective of what the conversation's going to be and what the objectives are. But it comes down to conflict management because you're trying to resolve really what the patient's goals are with palliative care. What is their goal of care for this particular point in time? Because it's only one step in a process, and you have to start somewhere. So what happens is people come to this conversation with often myths about what it's going to be. Oh, we're coming to talk about hospice. Oh, we're coming to talk about more oncology, more chemotherapy or more radiation. And everyone's coming in with this kind of altered perception about what the conversation's going to be. And what it really should be is about what the goals for the patient are and representing what we call substituted judgment is if the person can't speak for themselves. So you can see why that is a conflict management type of situation. And as a consequence of that, people come to this with their own biases, and we have to address that. So I put the tightrope up to let you understand that this is more of a metaphorical, high-tension conversation. So it's important to start to say what is palliative care and what it's not, because there are these misconceptions. A lot of people just think it's hospice. And although all of hospice, which is end-of-life care, is palliative or comfort-based by nature, not all palliative care is hospice, because not everyone who requires a conversation about their goals of care are actively dying. And hospice is meant for patients who are having a life expectancy of 6 months or less. Palliative care can be delivered to anyone at any time who wants to talk about what their goals are. So what is palliative care? It's medical care for all the seriously ill and not just the dying. It's about dealing with their pain, their symptoms of that pain, and I always underline the word suffering because I think it's a word that we don't use often enough, yet it's something that patients and families immediately know. But as physicians and as of care and hospital staff, we don't use that word suffering because it's too ambiguous. But you know it when you see it. And I think it's something that people relate to. So I use the word suffering a lot. What palliative care is, it's providing assistance in decision-making. And again, determining what that goals of care is. And adding an extra layer of support to the group of caregivers that are already in place. It's not an all or nothing thing, which is one of the myths. You can either have palliative care because there's nothing else we can do. There's always something else we can do. So what palliative care is not, it's not. There's nothing left to do. So, oh, we'll do this. It's separate from curative treatments? No, you can have palliative care alongside your curative treatments. In fact, you should, because you should know what your goals are of those treatments. And without having that goal, as Dr. DeVita said, hope is something we always want to support, but we want a realistic hope, and we want a realistic goal. So you want to have that conversation. Of course, everyone expects to survive. That's their goal. But we also want to put it in a context that doesn't lead them to I wish I knew that I really only had, an expectation of an X amount of time. I would have thought this through differently. And finally, palliative care is not based on cost. Hospice is a government entitlement. Palliative care currently is not, and it's delivered in most hospitals that have 300 beds or more in our country. But unfortunately, it doesn't have an entitlement, so a lot of people often don't get offered it because it's not a free service that the government would automatically reimburse for. It's reimbursed more along the lines of any other specialist. So people often forego or don't even get offered it because it's not a free service at the end of life, which the government will pick up the entire expense. So we can move on to the next slide. So it's important to understand the disease course if you're going to have a conversation about palliative care, because as I said, palliative care should be given alongside aggressive therapies in order to set the parameters to how far the care someone wants to receive is. In other words, when you're having this goals of care discussion, you want to say, I would like to get X amount of care and I'd like to avoid X amount of care. And you get to actually have that conversation with a palliative care provider. And at the time of your aggressive therapies, to say, I'm willing to go this far. And then as your disease progresses, as you could see on the bottom of the slide, we go from diagnosis to progression of disease, and then to finally death. And palliative care, the advantage of it introduced early on is that it can be carried throughout the course of the person's illness. It helps to relieve suffering, improve quality of life, pain and symptoms, and also services for psychosocial, spiritual, and legal needs. And so it helps patients to adjust and adapt, and family members along the way as well, to the progression of disease, instead of having full curative treatments and then you get dropped off a cliff of, with that expression, there's nothing else that we can do for you. There's always something else we can do. And palliative care offered at the beginning of a diagnosis then allows for continued support throughout the course to help people do life closure, to help them when they're actively dying in hospice, and also to follow up with the families for bereavement care. We can move on. So it's a person-centered type of care, and it's centered around a phrase that's called total pain. And like I said before, I use the word suffering a lot, because Dame Cicely Saunders, who was the founder of the hospice and palliative care movement, she coined the phrase back in '64 of total pain, because she said suffering encompasses all struggles, whether those struggles be physical, social, psychological, or spiritual. And the background for her, I think, is fascinating, because she was a social worker in London in the 50s, and she felt that nobody was listening to her. So she said, I'm going to go back to school and be a nurse, and then they're going to listen to me, because I see these people suffering. And I think that, if I'm a professional, medical provider, they're going to listen to me. She became a nurse. Nobody was listening to her. She said, okay, I'm going to be a doctor. She got her medical degree. Guess what? Nobody listened to her. And she said, I'm tired of fighting a system that's not listening. And she opened the first hospice at St. Christopher's in London. And she said, I'm just going to do it myself, because I know what suffering is. And she became really the founder of the hospice movement. And ironically, when Connecticut started its first hospice, they asked her to come here to help us design the first hospice in Connecticut, which is really a feather in the cap of the state of Connecticut. The reality is, now here we are, 40 years later, and unfortunately, enrollment in hospice is still less than 2 weeks, even though it's meant to be a 6-month program. We still haven't achieved that goal of being able to help people, and the expression hospice uses is meet them where they are and take them where they need to be along that disease progression. And we're hopeful that as palliative care becomes more widespread, that will become a reality. And so the last slide talks about those challenges that keep people on that emotional tightrope. The palliative care provider who's coming in to have the conversation, and again, all the other stakeholders. So the challenges are having the patient and family admit what their end-of-life concerns are. Michael mentioned that it's often not what you think it is. If you ask someone, are you afraid of dying? They'll say, I'm more afraid of leaving my daughter with her 2 children because she can't afford to live by herself, and they live off of my Social Security check. Those are the type of concerns that we hear more often than I'm afraid of dying. They're more afraid of the people they're going to leave behind. It's about pain and symptom management, or as I said, suffering, because as Dame Cicely Saunders said, suffering comes in many different phases, and they often overlap. So if someone's emotionally suffering, they're physically suffering more. The way the brain processes pain causes emotional suffering to be transmuted into physical pain. And unless you ask the question about what kind of pain, what is the source of your suffering, you're not going to be able to relieve anyone's physical pain. The other challenge is predicting life expectancy. No one's got a crystal ball, but we can address the larger picture, because palliative care often uses the phrases days to weeks, weeks to months, months to years. We're not going to necessarily give a finite amount of time, but at least that couches it in a manner that people can kind of get their heads around. Communication is the basis of it all. And as I said, making decisions based on the goals that the person has. Those goals are based on the person's values, their preferences, their hopes, and the psychological and psychosocial impact of making these decisions. Some people know exactly what they want, but they're just too concerned about the impact that that will have on their loved ones to actually say it. And these conversations should be shaped by each person's unique physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and cultural needs at the point of time that you're having the conversation. It's, remember, a process. And there's a wonderful form in the state of Connecticut that's called the MOLST form. I'm not a paper person, but I think it really helps people very easily get from that 30,000-foot view of this is such a big subject, I don't know how to approach it. Within 7 questions, it could get them down to a much more narrowed understanding of how much is a bridge too far in their care at this particular point in time. They could always change their mind. There's a whole page at the end of the MOLST form for revisions. So it acknowledges that this is a process. It's not a one-off. It's not one conversation. It's walking the walk, meeting people where they are and taking them where they need to be. And you can download that form on the Department of Health, Connecticut Department of Health website, and see how in 7 questions you can go from doing everything to comfort care. And it's quite a revelation.
What is exactly it called?
It's the MOLST, the Medical Orders of Life-Sustaining Treatment. In other states, it's known as the POLST, or POLST, Physician Orders of Life-Sustaining Treatment. Connecticut allows nurse practitioners to also do it, so that's why it's medical orders. I think it opens up the conversation and really helps people get their head around how to start this discussion. And other challenges is that confusion over hospice versus palliative care, which I just touched upon, but Sharon's going to talk with much more expertise than I on that. And finally, the barriers of palliative care. What do I mean by barriers? Well, it's those prejudices that people bring to the conversation that are based on usually bad prior experiences with having these kind of conversations, whether about death or just being dismissed out of hand with regard to their concerns, lack of education about what palliative care and hospice is, having previous people, had their perception being, oh, well, hospice, that's just hanging a bag of morphine and actively ending someone's life. No, that's not what hospice is. There's a lot of differentiation between how much pain and symptom management is being done and what the intention of that treatment is. So when we talk about having a compassionate approach to someone's life, it is based on what their goals are, it is based on what their intention is, and it's also based on the intention of the provider that's taking care of them. And so I thank you all for your time and for having the opportunity to come and talk to you about palliative care tonight.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon Bradley, and I'm a registered nurse who has been working in the hospice and palliative care field for over 25 years. And I thank you all for joining us this evening, and I thank Dr. DeVita and Dr. Coletti for their great presentations to us this evening. What I'd like to spend a few minutes on is talking with you about how to access some of the support and care that we've talked about this evening. We think about what kind of support we might need if we are caring for a loved one who is facing a very serious illness. We ourselves may be facing long-term chronic illnesses. And how do we go about locally receiving some support to begin conversations regarding wishes and goals and overall care. We're fortunate here in our area of the state to have a lot of very good resources. Most of the hospitals in our areas have palliative care teams, so that if you or a loved one is in the hospital and is experiencing some sort of treatment or condition that maybe is becoming burdensome, becoming a level of suffering, you and your family can request a consult by the palliative care team at the hospital. And that team, which is often comprised of physicians, nurses, social work, clergy, can come and visit with you and help you kind of define and help your loved one kind of define what your goals are and what some alternatives or support and treatment in the inpatient setting can be. So keep that in mind, that you yourself can request a consult from the palliative care team. In the community, where most of our services are provided in home care settings, there are a lot of wonderful resources in our area. We have with us this evening some representatives from some of the home health and hospice agencies who provide service in our area. Visiting Nurse and Hospice of Fairfield County, my agency. I know Regional Hospice is here, and Constellation. So the Medicare program has actually a special benefit called the Medicare benefit. And in our world, we often say this is one of the best kept secrets in the Medicare program. Because if someone is facing a life-limiting illness and they've decided that they don't want to continue active, aggressive treatment, and they prefer to pursue a comfort course, perhaps hospice care is a direction that they might wish to go. And if one elects the hospice benefit, all medications, all supplies, all care associated with that end-of-life diagnosis are covered by the Medicare program 100%. And we know that medications can be very expensive, equipment and supplies. So bear that in mind, that there is a very special benefit in the Medicare program for hospice. Hospice teams in our communities are comprised of hospice physicians. with expertise like Donna Coletti and Dr. DeVita, who are very expert at managing symptoms, helping with end-of-life conversations, and working with you and your families during this very often challenging and difficult time. We can also help with volunteer support and supportive services of clergy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, to make it easier to manage the care of oneself or loved one, as well as supportive services of Reiki, massage, music therapy, pet therapy, basically you name it, and hospice care in the home can provide it. And the third setting where care can be provided is a residence other than a private residence. And I'm talking in this way about skilled nursing facilities, nursing homes, assisted living settings, inpatient hospices, such as a regional hospice in Brantford, regional hospice in Danbury, and Connecticut hospice, and Connecticut hospice in Brantford. And then the very unique Fairfield County House, which is assisted living, where we welcome all hospice providers into care of our 8 residents, 6, but we have the capacity for 8 as of next week, so we're eagerly looking forward to that. And all hospice services can be brought to individuals and families there, and this is true also in the inpatient settings. So there are a lot of opportunities for end-of-life care in our communities. We are very fortunate in this area to have rich resources. Right here locally in Westport, I've had the privilege of working with Human Services Department, particularly Sue Pfister in the Center for Senior Activities, very knowledgeable, as you all know who know Sue, of the resources that are available very locally. And I know that she is always open to talking with people about supporting conversations and comfort in our communities. I also, in closing, just want to share with you I was privileged a couple years back to be a volunteer advisor in the creation of a wonderful compilation of personal stories. This was a project that was envisioned by Dan Levinson, who many of you know here in Westport. And it was, I'm going to show it, and read to you the title, In Death, the Gift of Life. And this was edited, as I said, it's a compilation, and the editor is Allison McBain. And I know that this is part of the Westport Library's holdings. These are personal stories of families who lived in or near Westport and who kindly and generously opened their stories and their lives to many of our writers from Westport Writes, and Fairfield Scribes, to share their stories so that the rest of us could learn. And I highly recommend this to you, just as you look for other resources to support an ongoing conversation for yourselves and for your loved ones in the community going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for staying here and listening to that. That was a lot of information, so I hope you have some questions. And I think Carrie is going to come around with the microphone. This is being live streamed and also recorded, so we want to make sure your question is captured.
Down here in front, right down here.
Oh, you
just
were helping.
Oh, okay.
You were helping her, okay.
Thank you. More a comment than a question. Unfortunately, Sue Pfister has retired from her role. And she was wonderful. And I presume that her replacement will also be wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh, good to know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, while we're waiting, I have a story I thought
Yes,
of while you
Michael
were
has good
talking.
stories.
I have a lot of stories. unfortunately for the listener. So I was a critical care doctor, I gave that up just recently, and it was funny. The reason I got into palliative care was because I was in critical care. You're constantly working at the edge of life, and you can ignore what happens if you don't win, as it were, or you can embrace it and learn about it. So that's how I got into it, was everybody who's in the ICU is confronting the notion of death, and nobody talks about it there, no one. So I got called to see a patient, and they said, this guy, he's so sick, he's dying, he's got lung disease, he's got heart disease, we just got the breathing tube out of him, and he's off the machine, he's gonna go back on, there's no way he can survive, and we keep talking to him about, do you really wanna go back on it? And he says, yes, absolutely, I wanna go back on it, I need to live. And they were getting frustrated. They couldn't talk him into what they thought was the reasonable approach, was to let the disease that he was dying from finally allow him to die. So they asked me to go talk to him, and I just went in and said, who I am and what I try to do, and I said, tell me your story. And it turned out he said, well, I need to tell you, I was a terrible husband and a terrible father. For the first 20 years of my marriage, 3 kids, I was drinking, I was shooting up. Sometimes I had a job, sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I was at home, sometimes I wasn't. And then I got my stuff together, and I went to rehab. And for the past 8 years, I've really been doing good. But my wife, through those first 20 years, even though I was a very bad husband, I was a bad man, she was a good wife. And I owe it to her. I need to stay here. I'm not going to abandon her with our kids. They're older now, but I just can't leave her and leave her alone. And she was in the room hearing this. And she said, no, honey, it's okay. You can leave us. And he says, no, I really need to do this. And I said, it sounds to me like you need permission to die. And he said, that's it. And so they both started crying. I started crying. And she said, of course I give you permission. You've been wonderful. It's not often you get to see husbands or spouses, I'll generalize it, spouses rehabilitate themselves and then work so hard to make up for what they did wrong. And you've earned your death, and we will have the kids here with you. Just you need to know that it's okay with us. And he said, all right. And so we filled out the MOLS form that you were talking about. And he died about 2 or 3 days later with his family around the bedside. And it was so instructive to me to not talk about what we wanted to do, but really focus more on what was motivating him. And I didn't ask him what's motivating him. I just said, tell me your story. What's going on? And he was dying to share this information. It just poured out of him. And I was so happy that I was fortunate enough that his wife was in the room when I was talking to them. But I think it underscores the importance of addressing it head on, and it actually is much easier to do than you would think.
Thank you for sharing that, for sure.
Yeah.
What is our time? What is our, I don't have a watch.
We have a couple more
Okay.
questions, I think.
I was just interested in in the subject of pain and how you alleviate pain in palliative care or in a hospital setting or a hospice setting. I know it's not high on the list of concerns, but it seems. But I'm just what I'm missing is just what in fact you can do to alleviate pain that is felt physically, and is suffering. And I just haven't heard anything about that.
Okay. Pain is a big part of palliative care. 1/3 of our consults are for pain, and their average age is actually more like 50 and 40 than 70, 80, 90 that you might expect. There are a lot of things that we could do for pain. So right now we focus more on multimodal therapy, where we're talking about non-medical as well as medical methods. And in the medicines, we talk about non-morphine-like drugs as well as other drugs. In the old days, it was Tylenol and Demerol, or Tylenol and Dilaudid, something like that. And we still use the Tylenol all the time, but I find that probably 80% of the patients, I can manage their pain without using any opioid. It does happen, but rarely, that somebody will have pain that no matter what you do, there's surgical approaches that you can do, and nerve blocks, and this acupuncture. It's a lot that you can do for it, but sometimes nothing ever works, and then we can do something which is called terminal pain management, where we will use very high dose opioids, whatever it takes to make somebody comfortable. And then if they die, that's okay. We just don't want them to die in pain. We're not aiming for them to die. We're aiming for them to have adequate pain relief. So I don't think these days, I wonder what you think about this, I don't think anybody has to die in pain. It can be managed.
I completely agree. And at the risk of being too open kimono, I'll tell you my first terminal delirium case that I couldn't manage. And it was at the Rosenthal when Stanford Hospital still had it, and prior to the Fairfield County House. It was my mother. I couldn't manage my own mother for the first time. She was on subcutaneous dilaudid pumps, too, and she was in acute delirium. And so we had to move her over to the hospital. And Steve Lowe was an amazing oncologist, and he just said, Donna, don't worry, we'll bring her in here, and we'll do palliative sedation on her. And I said, okay, the one person I can't handle is my own mother. So he brought her in there, and she was in an agitated delirium, and he gave her IV Dilaudid and IV Ativan in doses that could have knocked out an elephant. And I will tell you, she got to a place of such peace and serenity that when this spiritual care provider came over and said, would you mind if I sang Amazing Grace to her? Because that was her favorite song. I said, by all means. And the other hospice nurses came over, and they were around her bed, literally singing Amazing Grace. And she was mouthing the words while they were singing. It was one of the most remarkable things I'd ever seen. So what I mentioned when I was speaking, for me, it's about intention. And the intention was to alleviate her suffering, because she was terribly suffering, as was I, watching her. And they were able to achieve a palliative sedation for her, which allowed her to still, even with advanced dementia, she was able to mouth, because she knew that, that was her favorite hymn. She was able to participate in it, and it gave everyone such a sense of peace. And so I hope, Mary Lou, that helps you see that there are extremes that we can still manage.
I'd like to add a little bit to what you're saying. So embedded in that discussion is that you were trying to manage her at home.
No, this was at the Rosenthal Hospice.
So the point I was going to bring up is you don't have to be in a place in order to get hospice. Hospice is not a location. There's no geography to hospice. Hospice is a level of care that's provided. And I think there's an increasing trend of patients whose family, along with some of the support services you described, they choose to die at home. It takes work, it takes planning, but we're at Harlem Hospital, we're putting about 6 patients from hospital back into their own bed at home to get hospice care. And I get letters from almost all of them. Thank you so much for enabling that process.
Thank you for asking that question, Mary Lou. I think it was probably on people's minds, for sure.
Yeah, I came in late, so if you've already said this, then I'll listen to it on tape. But my question is, if you don't want to go there, you don't have, but what about if the person, I don't want to say assisted suicide, but if it's just like, I don't want to, you don't want to live to be able to mouth words to a song. I mean, that's not what you want. you want to die before that, how does that get integrated?
Oregon, Vermont.
Do you want to do or you want me to?
Oh,
Okay, so.
I mean, I'm wondering.
So this is a very hot subject around the country and around the world, the notion of assisted dying. And we just had some proposed legislation in Connecticut which did not pass. But there are people who believe that that notion that you had, that's not the way I want to go. I want to die earlier under my own control. It's not legal here, but I can see the case that people are making for it, that it's my life to choose how I live. It should be my life to choose how I die. Do I need to wait to be suffering in order to get the kind of care that I want and get the kind of death that I want? And so it's, you're going to be reading a lot about this as additional states are starting to pick it up. Right now, it's really very restricted, and it's not allowable in Connecticut. But we do try to do our best to make sure that people's final days are as very comfortable as possible, and we do not do, as a rule, we do not do anything to hasten death. Our focus, as you said, the intention is to make people feel better for the rest of their life.
Oh, I see. But do you see that it's going in that direction, or?
It's very hot, this topic, and I don't know which way it's going to go. I think the few states that are doing it, most people are considering it to be a sociological experiment, and there are reports, good and bad, coming from those places, and I think a lot of the nation is watching to see what happens.
Thank you.
But you can't prevent someone from deciding to stop eating, right?
Correct.
So there are options even within a state that doesn't have that kind of legislation.
So as people approach death, one of the things that happens is they lose appetite. And so it is very common for people to not eat at the very end of life. They don't die of starvation. They don't. They're dying of the underlying disease. If you starve yourself, it takes months to actually die from starvation. So I don't worry about that too much. I try to get people in a frame of mind where they're willing to eat. We call it pleasure feeding. And so we find out what they want to eat, when they want to eat, and if they want it, you give it to them. If they don't, fine, that's their pleasure. My joke I tell people is, if you want to have a McDonald's milkshake 3 meals a day, fine, you've earned it. So.
I actually had a different question for Dr. DeVita, and that was, you had a slide up that said, don't use euphemisms, death, dying, right? And then you used the term pass away. And I just want to ask, what does that mean to you?
So I have lost count on the number of people I've spoken to where I'll talk to the doctors, what's happening here? Oh, she's dying, she's just not accepting it. Well, have you told her? Yeah, I've told her 1,000 times what's happening. She just doesn't get it. She's in denial. And I'll go into the room and I'll say, has anybody talked to you about what's happening? Yes, that they're talking to me. Has anybody mentioned to you that you're dying? No. Then we have a conversation about dying, and then they'll say, doctor, thank you so much. You're the first person that's talked to me about dying, even though all the other doctors had been trying to. So I think it's really, really important to say the words, as I mentioned, to break the glass, to get the conversation started. Once you know what you're talking about, then it's okay to use other words. We in all of our speech, we kind of choose which words we're going to use at which time. But I think, at least in initiating the conversation, you got to use it. I don't think there's any way around it.
Thank you. And Michael, you mentioned something that I'd wanted to say, so you triggered me to bring up something that I think is one of the biggest barriers. We know that pain is undertreated, way undertreated. There was an article just today I saw, especially in African American population, they're not being offered and they're not filling their prescriptions when they are being written for them, because there is such a bias about taking these medications, fear of addiction, fear of being perceived as weak. It's mostly all myth. And so unfortunately, there is a lot of suffering because people want to be perceived as being, the good patient. And they want to be perceived as strong. They also want to maintain their mentation. And they want to be able to make their own decisions and maintain their dignity. And I think the main reason people suffer is because of undertreatment, whether it's they're not being offered it or they're being offered it and they're not taking it. So what Michael said that reminded me was that I often say this to families and to patients when they're reluctant to take pain medicine, is that no one is hastening the person's death. Again, about intention. The person is dying of their disease. And one of the biggest barriers is family members and caregivers fearful that if they do administer a opioid or a benzo, something that potentially lowers their respiratory rate or their heart rate, they're gonna have a guilt of, oh, should I have given it to them? Am I causing this person's death? But what Michael said is the truth. The person is dying of their underlying disease. Your intention is to ease their suffering. It's not to intentionally end their life at, as he said, in our state, in our current culture. So I feel that always repeating that for family and caregivers helps to relieve that shoulda, coulda, woulda, oh my God, what did I do, fear. That your intention is what we call in medicine the double effect. There's higher benefit of relieving suffering than there is having a negative impact, that the negative impact is secondary to the comfort.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We're going to be here for a while, so feel free to share your questions up here with us or down there with the refreshments. And thank you again for joining us this evening. It's nice to see you all.